Hey everyone, Mulligan here, and welcome to another episode of Eternal Errors. We're looking at another draft today. Granted, I did a draft episode 2 videos ago, but it's been a while since the last Eternal Errors, and this was a draft that I did a while back that I really wanted to look over and analyze what exactly went wrong. So we're doing that today, and this will actually be in a slightly different format than the last draft episode. Most of this video will be focused on the draft portion and where I went wrong with certain picks that affected the draft deck negatively. Without further ado, let's jump in. First, I want to start by showing the deck I ended up building with my cards. I'll go ahead and say it now. I ended up going 3-3 with pretty much this exact list. And I say that because I changed one card after 2 losses, which I'll mention towards the end of the video. I shared the finished draft deck on Discord. A few people were saying that Shepherd's Horn and Workshop Forge were the weakest cards in my deck, which I agree with. 1 or 2 people also said that splashing Shadow for Combust didn't make sense. Admittedly, I didn't tell the full story of how the draft deck came about. I just showed them the finished product. If I had shown them the litter that I had to pick from, as far as card choices, they might have had a different tune. But let's run it back. Let's go all the way back to the beginning of the draft, back to pack 1, pick 1. So pack 1, pick 1. Not exactly a shortage of cards to pick from. Prosecutor at Arms is pretty good. Striped Arachnodon is a decent role player. Extract and Mortar are good removal cards to have. Even Blister Sting Wasp isn't awful. But at the end of the day, I followed the bread theory as far as what is the most important to pick first. And for those that know, the bread theory stands for bombs, removal, evasion, or efficiency, depending on who you ask, aggro, and dregs. And from left to right, it's ordered from the most important to the least important. So bombs are the most important, and then dregs are the least important. So, being a bomb, I picked Plated Goliath. Pick number 2. Thunderhoof Warrior is solid. I went with Awakened Sentinel though because I didn't know what other faction I wanted to move into yet. I didn't want to pick Voyaging Lumen since I had no cards that gained health yet. Note that Blink Wolf will end up being one of the few chances I had at drafting a good 2-drop, but I wasn't thinking about 2-drops right now. I figured I could pick some up towards the end. On to pick number 3. This pack I admittedly decided to rare draft because I didn't have a 4th copy of Workshop Forge yet. There were several cards that I could have picked over the Forge. Thunderhoof Warrior and Talon of Nostrix were probably the most obvious ones to me. Maybe even either one of the Xenon cards would have been okay too, since it was so early and I hadn't locked into another faction yet. At this point, I just decided to go for Praxis based on what I'd seen so far. There didn't seem to be a shortage of fire or time cards. The rest of this pack goes fine. And then we get to pick number 13, which is pack 2. Real quick, I wanted to mention something about this pack. So there were a few cards I could have taken, but I think Rebel Sharpshooter was the safest pick, if not the best one. Granted, Acolyte can be good too, but I didn't have the early game units to really take advantage of it. It's possible I overlooked Initiate of the Sands in hindsight. I didn't consider her at all because she's a 1-drop, and most of them are generally pretty bad in draft, but removal is harder to come by, and she might have helped with what was turning out to be a pretty slow mid-range deck. Note that Sauropod Wrangler was another chance to get a 2-drop, but again, I wasn't thinking about 2-drops right now. I thought it was still too early to start getting them, and only Plated Goliath would have its cost reduced so far. The next 2 picks go fine. Stonescar Maul was clearly the best pick in the next pack, and Vorlunk was the only pick in the pack after that. And then we get to pick number 16. This was the worst pick I made in the entire draft in my opinion. I sat here for a bit trying to decide between Slow and Teleport. I end up taking Slow because it was at this point where I realized, oh, I don't have a lot of 2-drops at all. So I tried to make up for my lack of proactive plays on the first 2 turns by taking slow, thinking it might be decent. I absolutely should have taken teleport. Neither card is exactly great, but teleport works better in a more tempo heavy deck, which this deck is not. But it's generally better than slow is, and I might have needed to accept that my deck would just be a slower mid-range deck with a really good top end. And no, I wasn't desperate enough to take Humbug. The next several picks go fine. The next pick I could have had a 3rd Stone Scar Maul, but that would have been incorrect unless I somehow planned on not playing Play to Goliath, and I wasn't going to do that. The next pack starts off fine too until we get to the second pick, which would be pick number 26 total. So once again here, I decided to rare draft this pack. There always seems to be that one rare that completely escapes you, no matter how many packs in a given set that you open, and Shepherd's Horn was that one for me. I did finally get my 4th copy of it after this draft. But back to the pick. Here the only other choice would have been Zenith Stranger in my opinion, since I don't like Burning Glaive at all. It would have been a 2-drop that, as it would turn out, I desperately needed, especially given that I splashed Shadow later on anyway. It's crazy though, because Shepherd's Horn, it looks so good in the final deck list with the Overwhelmed units and the Disciplined Amanera I would soon pick up. So the very next pick, because I had Workshop Forge, I valued Awakened Sentinel higher, enough for me to pick it over Pummel. This one I'm not sure on in hindsight. Part of me wished I took Pummel for the combat trick and for the ability to filter through top decks I don't need. But I personally don't think Sentinel is that bad of a 5-drop. It would be interesting to know what you guys would have done here, but my pick does get justified in a bit. So the next few picks go fine. I pick up the Disciplined Amanera that I mentioned earlier. My Overwhelmed units start to trickle in when I finally take a Thunderhoof Warrior. And I get a Pummel anyway, and a Cannon Bear. Then we get to pick number 32. And I snap picked the Reforge over the Envelop. So, for those of you who have been following me for a while and watched my set review of the time cards and Omens of the Past, you would know that I did not have good things to say about Envelop. I would always ask, why would I play this over Teleport, even in draft? In hindsight, I should have taken Envelop here. Reforge was way too greedy of a pick. It gets back Stone Scar Maul, but if the game is going that late to where I'm able to bring them all back, I'm probably winning anyway. The only time that wouldn't be the case is in a board stall, and a single target weapon in that situation may not necessarily break board parity. It would all depend on what my opponent has on board. Envelop, if nothing else, is cheaper than Teleport, so yeah, I should have taken Envelop here and not the Reforge. This was probably the second worst pick I made in the draft. The next few picks are uneventful. I get a Swift Stranger. I rare draft once again and take a Mating Call over Awakened Sentinel, although that would have been my 3rd copy and I wasn't playing 3 of them, so in a way it didn't really matter what I took there. And then we get to pack 4, pick 1. So this is pick number 37 total. This was a tough one for me. General Azalea was very tempting for me, but I felt my late game was already set, and I wasn't exactly going to be the aggressor in the early game with the deck I had. But this is where I wish I didn't take Shepherd's Horn, because I felt that I got jaded a little by it here. I end up taking Vorlunk over Praxis Displacer for the synergy with the Horn. Maybe I could justify it by saying I was all in on my strategy at this point, so the 3-4 body is better, or that Praxis Displacer is better in an aggressive deck, which I didn't have. But either way, I have second thoughts about this pick, even looking back at it now. In the next pack, Furnace Mage and Teleport were considerations, but Steelfang Chakram was just too good to pass up, since it has synergy with a bunch of units in my deck. And then we get to pick number 39, and General Azalea shows up once again, 2 packs later. I stick with the mindset I had before that my late game was already taken care of, and I take Amber Acolyte instead. Flame Blast, in hindsight, maybe should have been a consideration because I had very few actual removal in the deck. I was basically relying on my units being better than my opponents. Normally, if you're playing time, that's the mindset you have to have anyway, but it may have been worth picking up what could have been decent and, if nothing else, flexible removal. The rest of the picks are pretty much decided for me, though I still managed to mess up one of them. I finally pick up some 2-drops in a pair of Stonescar Strangers in the 11th hour, but my 2-drop slot is still pretty anemic. I take another Predator's Instinct over Recalculator since I felt like I had enough good 4-cost cards, and the deck was very light on removal. I pick up some Fixing and Stonescar Banner, and a late Combust, which both turned out to be pretty key when actually building the deck, I felt. The one final mistake I make was taking Tinker Apprentice over Scheme. I didn't know if I was going to be splashing Shadow or not, but I needed to consider that possibility at that moment instead of much later in the deck building process, because Scheme was clearly the better pick, even if I didn't end up playing it. And this is the list I came up with. This draft was not without a few gameplay mistakes though. One thing I just wanted to mention really quick, this is the very first game that I play against Mega Warelord, who's on Skycrag. I just wanted to openly admit that I completely forgot that Workshop Forge only reduces the cost of warp cards on top of your deck. And as you can see here, I kept mousing over my warp cards in hand, wondering why I didn't get the cost reduction. So yeah, you get so excited for synergies in your deck, but you gotta make sure you actually read your cards, guys. But the main game that I wanted to focus on was actually game 3 against Minnow XL, who's on Argenport. And I've got a Longshot Marksman with a Beast Caller's Amulet equipped, coming in for an attack. And on this turn, I actually let the Longshot Marksman with the weapon go, thinking I could combust on my turn, not realizing that I didn't have Shadow Influence. This was pretty big because I end up taking 8 more damage due to not blocking on my opponent's next turn, hoping to draw into Shadow to cast Combust, or at least play the Archive Curator to deal with the Longshot Marksman. Ultimately, it would have just bought me 1 extra turn so I could Stonescar Maul and potentially clear the board, since I would have had 1 extra unit to challenge the Longshot Marksman. It's just crazy what you end up learning about your draft decks after you end up putting them together. And I think it was mostly apparent here in game 2 against Ender, who's on Firetime Justice. But this game clearly showed the deck's weakness, which was the lack of removal that I had. And despite me getting Shepherd's Horn synergy and gaining a ton of life, because of the lack of removal, I was still outmatched by my opponent's Awakened Student along with their support units as well, and I just couldn't remove anything. It once again goes back to what I said about if you're in time, then you rely on your units being better than theirs, and that definitely was not the case this game at all. But that's it for this episode of Eternal Errors. For those that made it to the end, thanks so much for watching. The goal of these videos are always to learn from my own mistakes so we can all get better at the game. If you did like it, feel free to give the video a like. If you want to see more content from me, feel free to look around my channel and also consider subscribing so you don't miss future videos. And just as a kind of a reminder, if you guys missed it, I did recently review all the cards from The Tale of Horus Traver. So if you missed that set review video, feel free to check that out. I'll have a link to it on your screen. But one other thing, clicking the bell icon it does guarantee that you never miss a video from me if you don't mind notifications. But thanks again for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.